Welcome to the scurrychurchofchrist.org. The Bible says in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Please don't let this happen to you. Feel free to contact us at scurrychurchofchrist.org, where you can visit us, and any Bible question that you may have, we will do our best to answer. We are so glad you decided to visit us. Morning. As we continue in our series on marriage, of course, thanks to Kyle and Alyssa. Again, congratulations. I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter, well, you can hold that, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because that's where I'm coming from, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But I want you to, as we quickly review, I want you to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, but a whole chapter 7, because that's what we're dealing with. And 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 33. I want you to see this, and I want us to, this is how I look at this as I deal with these passages. It says, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. So God is not a God of confusion. In some versions, I think the King James said he's not the author of confusion. And so as I deal with these verses, there's a lot of confusion, and so have I been in some areas. But then I realized that God is not the author of it, and so why are we, some of us, confused? It's not God. I think it's us, and I know it's difficult sometimes to deal with certain passages, but it's that God is not the author of it. And so look at Matthew 19, and remember 1 Corinthians 14:33, and so I'm just going to read it as it what it says, and based on the text, and then we'll go to Matthew 5, and then we'll head into 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And so notice that in verse 2 and verse 3, some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And that's not new. That's not a new concept, because that's what's going on today. And so it's like there's no boundaries when it comes to a divorce. And so Jesus gives the answer. And we looked at last week and a week before that in John chapter 12 and verse 48 and following, Jesus was not speaking of his own initiative. He was saying what the Father commanded him to say. And so remember, his words come from the heavenly realm. And so what he says, he said in verse 4, and he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And so right there, we know that as it relates to marriage, and we'll do a lesson on this, he deals with male and female. I mean, that's God is not the author of confusion. You see, when we start to change that, we confuse it, but it says male and female. And so when he said, but notice he goes right back to the beginning, and that's a general statement that marriage is for the entire world. And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. He goes right back to the book of Genesis in Genesis chapter 2, right back to the beginning. And he says, watch this. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. And what therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And so as we said before, marriage is something that God established, and it's in the heavenly realm. See, he established it, and he established the rules. And so he knows when people are marrying, and he knows if they're doing it according to his will or not according to his will. And see, he joins them together, and God does not go against his law. And so if someone is doing it against his law, he's not going to join them together. And those who do it according to his will, his law, of course, with the new covenant, he will join them together. And so you see, God knows the marriage in the heavenly realm. He established it. And then he says, let no man separate. And so actually no one can separate a marriage. Only God does the separating. And that's why as we get into passages, we saw that the only grounds for divorce is adultery. And so if that's not the case, then the civil law will give a person a certificate of divorce, but God is not going to separate because it's against his will. And so this is what he is. I'm trying to keep it simple because it says he's not an author of confusion. And so the Jews, you notice they were not looking to be taught. They were trying to prove their point. And they said to him, why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, see, from the beginning, it was not so. And as I said before, notice when God gives the law of marriage, of course, starts with Adam and Eve, he does not discuss divorce. See? And so Jesus goes back to the beginning. And so in verse 9, he said, but then he said, but I say unto you. Now remember what we looked at in John chapter 12, verse 48 and following. Jesus did not say things of his own initiative. He makes it clear that I'm saying what the Father tells me to say. I'm following the commandments of God. And so what he's saying comes from the heavenly realm. And he says, but I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Now that's what he says. And so what am I supposed to say? And so he's saying the only grounds for divorce is adultery. And so if there's no adultery involved, and in the eyes of God in the heavenly realm, there's no divorce. So God is not separating you. And that's why if adultery is not involved and the person marries another, in the eyes of God, you are committing adultery because God had not separated you. And that's what he's saying now. But notice how the disciples understood. The disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. See, they understood. Because why would they say that? Because remember in the beginning, what the Jews taught, and in verse 3, some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And that's what they're familiar with. And when Jesus said no, when Jesus goes back to the beginning and says, the only grounds for divorce is adultery, and there's like, wait a minute. You see their mentality? That means I'm stuck. So Jesus, if that's the case, right, look, notice the disciples said to him, in the relationship of the man with his wife is like, if the relationship of the man and his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. That's not the way to go into a marriage. In other words, they're saying we have no way out. And Jesus lets them know that, but he said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who were made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who was able to accept this, let him accept it. And so the last part, I believe, pertains to the Apostle Paul. He made himself a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven. See how the Bible is very practical? You better be careful because not all men could take that position. But see, and you see, then go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. And so it's something that God established, and he made it very plain. And I think that he gives one way for divorce, not that he wants that, he desires that, but this is what it is. This came from heavenly realm. That's what he says. You see it in verse 32 of Matthew 5. But I say unto you, everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And so let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So, and I want you to think about 1 Corinthians 7, 14:33. God is not the author of confusion. And so as I look at that verse, I look at these, and why am I confused? So as I look at this, God is going to judge us by this new covenant, and the marriage law is in a new covenant. And so would God cause us to have a lack of understanding, or cause us to be confused and make it very difficult for us and then judge us by it? It's not fair. See? And so as I said before, as we go to Matthew chapter 7, or rather 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Jesus is dealing with this issue. You see in verse 12, but the rest I say. Now, remember in verse 8, he's dealing with, look at this, but I say to unmarried and to the widows. See, he's dealing with that. You see in verse 10, but to the married I give instructions. He's dealing with that. And then he says in verse 12, but to the rest I say. And so now he's going to deal with the rest. And the rest is this, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And so the rest, you see that. You see it in verse 9 or verse 8. You see it in verse 10. He deals with them, but to the rest. And so now he's going to deal with this issue, and he's going to answer these questions. And as we said in verse 12, this is a quick review, but look at verse 12. But the rest I say, not the Lord. If a brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. But now as we look at that, go to verse 10. But to the married I give instruction, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. So now he says, now remember, he says, not I, but the Lord. And so what does he do? And I want to make sure we grasp this. What does he do? He's going back to what the Lord said while he was on earth. So it's like they were taught, you know the laws of marriage. So you're asking me, now notice the question that they're asking, and a woman who has, look at verse 12, but the rest I say, not the Lord, that if a brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, he must not send her away. And so it's almost like, you know what the Lord said while he walked the earth. You know what the rules of marriage and divorce. And so let's go back to what the Lord said. And so they understood that. This was not something they didn't understand. And so he simplifies it. And they understood that. And so, you can't. Only grounds for divorce is adultery. And that's why he says the last part of verse 11, and the husband should not divorce his wife. And as I said before, the issue is not adultery. The issue is that if I have a unbelief, do I have to stay with my unbelieving husband, or do I have to stay with my unbelieving wife? Can I divorce them? No, because he goes back to what Jesus said. And if you do that, and God is not going to separate you. You see? And so remember, he's dealing with the issue here, and the issue is not, they're not saying, well, the issue is adultery, so what should I do? No, the issue here is not adultery. And Paul is not going to contradict himself. And so he confirms, he strengthens what Jesus said. The fact that he goes back to what Jesus said in Matthew 19:9, and he goes back to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, shows that what Jesus said is of the new covenant. And God is going to judge us by what Jesus said. He said, he that rejects me and receiveth not my word has one that judges him. The word that I have spoken shall judge him in the last day. That includes this. And so the intentions of God is that when we tie the knot, is that we stay together until death do us part. But if that doesn't go that way, this is the grounds that he gives. Now, and so as we notice what he says in verse 13, in verse 12, but the rest I say, not the Lord. In other words, the Lord didn't deal with this situation when he walked to earth. So, but we know the commandments of God. And so if a brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. Because why can't he? Because that's what Jesus gave the grounds for divorce. Watch. And a woman, verse 13, and he says, and a woman who has an unbelieving husband, that's the issue, and he consents to live with her, he must not send she must not send her husband away. She can't do that. Because what Jesus said. But notice what he says here, for the unbelieving wife is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband, for otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. And so what he's saying here, that God has sanctioned your marriage. And so your marriage is clean. You are married to an unbeliever, and so you have and you gotta get into the Greek culture. And so basically when you get into their culture back in the day, if you married within, say, the wife decided to become a Christian, the husband was still following the false gods, and she was expected to follow those false gods. So what should I do? So you don't give up your faith. But I like what he's saying here, that your marriage is clean. That's what he's saying here. Your marriage is pure. Your marriage is acceptable to God. And so if it wasn't, then your children would be unclean. So God, in other words, see, that's strange as Paul's saying, God has sanctioned this marriage. He accepted it. And I like what and he's not talking about salvation here. Because notice in verse 15, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Now watch this. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now he gets into salvation. And so in verse 14, your marriage is sanctioned. Your marriage is, he's keeping in context, he's dealing with marriage. God has sanctioned your marriage. Your marriage is considered clean. The marriage. See, when God gave the law of Genesis chapter 2, he gave that law to the entire world. And so when an unbeliever and a believer gets married and they follow God's law, God sanctions that. And we'll get into that version as we get into another lesson. But God sanctioned that. He gave that law to the entire world. For a man shall leave his father and mother, shall cling to his wife. And they shall become one flesh. That was given to the entire world. And they did that. And so God sanctioned that. So you can't say, now that I'm a Christian, can I get out? Or am I supposed to get out? And no. And so watch what he says here. We're just going to. So watch this. Verse 15, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Now notice what he says here before. We're going to deal with this a little bit, and I'm not going to be too long. Now I got to laugh at myself when I say that. But if the unbelieving one, notice this, if the unbelieving one leaves, he's not talking about the Christian. See, the marriage is sanctioned by God, but if the unbelieving one decides to leave, what do I do? Do I give up my faith, or what do I do? It's like I can't, if I'm married, I'm trying to hold that marriage together, but the other party wants to leave. What am I supposed to do? See, what am I supposed to give up my faith and follow them? What am I supposed to do? Can I make him stay, or can I make her stay? But notice talking about the unbeliever, and so that means the believer has a responsibility. See, the believer sticks to the law. The believer sticks to the law of Christ. It's like in the book of Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, they were suffering severely, and what were they supposed to do? They were supposed to be faithful, even in the midst of persecution. See? What did he say? Be faithful unto death, Revelation 2:10, and I will give you a crown of life. Even in the midst of death, I am to be faithful. Even in this turmoil, I am to be faithful, the believer. So if the unbeliever, I'll say it again. He said, if the unbeliever leaves, not you. Notice what's it. Yes, if the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. Let him leave. Does that mean that I no longer I can escape the marriage? So if this means that, watch this, a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. And so that means I'm no longer under bondage, the marriage bond? If that's the case, then it contradicts what Paul said. Because Paul said, you can't divorce. Paul said, if that's the case, reconcile. And so now he's saying that if they want to leave, they want to divorce, let them go, that you're not under bondage. In other words, now you're free to remarry again. That contradicts this whole statement. But notice something here. I want to show you something. The word bondage is very interesting, is doulo. And it's never used for marriage. I'm going to show you. You can look it up. In the American Standard Version, or rather the English Standard Version, in the ESV, it says in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. But before I go on, I want to show you something. In verse 27, if you're looking, he says, are you bound to a wife that is deo? He changes the word when it pertains to marriage to deo, D-E-O. In verse 39, he does it again. He changes the word in verse 39. Is a wife bound as long is a wife is bound as long as her husband lives? That's deo. But when he deals with now deo, D-E-O, and if we have any Greek scholars listening, I'm sorry if I said it wrong. No, I'm not. But notice what he says here in as you get into verse 15, the Greek word changes. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, see, let him leave. If the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage. The word is doulo. It changes. And it means to be enslaved. I mean, it's like when you're enslaved, you can't go. You have to tag along. You have no say-so. And so the point is that, listen, if that unbelieving one wants to leave, they want a divorce, hopefully you see it in the text that you all would reconcile, but it doesn't give you grounds for divorce. It's like he's saying that you're not enslaved in a marriage. You don't give up your faith. Notice what he says in verse 19. But circumcision is not, we'll get into that next week. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is keeping the commandments of God. See, that's what matters. And so if you have to decide between your faith and the spouse walking out the door, the unbeliever, then you keep your faith. And that's why the Greek word there is enslaved. It's never used for marriage. When he gets to marriage in those two verses, it's deo. See? And he says you're not enslaved to the point where you have to give up the commandments of God. And it ties in with, look at 1 Peter chapter 3, and then we'll close. 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, I think I'll have a habit of saying that because now I have to close. I really do. I think it's a habit because I say that, and then it's like I get stuck. So now some of y'all hold me to it, so now I have to close. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1. In the same, watch this. This is what he's saying. Watch this. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. As they observe your chaste and respectful behavior, your adornment must not be merely external, braided the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of the Lord. And so, in other words, this is your behavior will hopefully change the unbeliever to a believer. And that's why he said, you go back to, let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, of course, if you left. But notice verse 15. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. You are a peacemaker. You're not the one to say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. Now, if the unbeliever wants to behave that way, you keep who you are. You are a Christian. And then watch this, because why? Why? In verse 16, how do you know? Verse 16, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? That's why you behave that way, because your attitude, your actions may cause this unbeliever to reconcile and become a Christian. So be careful how you behave during this time. You still have a Christian responsibility. That's man and woman. Next week we'll continue in this, and I want to show you that as you read on these other passages to verse 25, that Paul is not changing. He's still involved in the same concept. And I want to show you how this fits in. And so I want us to see that we can't ignore Matthew 19:9 and Matthew 5:32, and we are held accountable to that. And God gave that commandment to the entire world. And he simplified it, and we must obey it. Because remember, he's going to judge us by the gospel, Acts 17, and we see that in John 12:48. So this is important that we understand this and our children understand this. And I told you that I talked to a friend of mine last week or the week before last, and I said, how are you all doing? And how's your marriage? And I thought he was going to say, doing just fine. He said, well, we're getting a divorce. And he said, we're still living together, but we just decided to do this. He said nothing about the gospel. Nothing. You realize they both made a decision without the gospel. Whose fault is that? It's his fault. That's her fault. It's not God's fault that people are involved in a predicament. We are in predicaments because we ignore the gospel. And what God does, he brings us back to the gospel. And our faith is shown by obeying the gospel, because God desires all to be saved. He's not going to go against his law, not against his marriage law. So it's not a hit in the face. It's a matter of salvation. It's preaching the truth in love. See, God established it, the marriage, and he sets the rules. If we can help you, please come out and stand and sing a song of invitation.